Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. This is Firoze Manji from Daraja Press. Welcome to our panel discussion, The Politics of Love and Rebellion. We have a really wonderful and interesting group of panelists today who I can introduce to you on our lovely poster. But let's get to the discussion. Let me introduce first of all Roberto. Roberto Hernández. Something's gone wrong with my screen here for some reason. Sorry, one moment. I'll just try and sort this out. Okay, here we go. Yeah. Okay. Yes, Roberto Roberto Hernández is associate professor of Chicano and Chicano studies at San Diego State University. He's the author of Coloniality of the U.S.-Mexico Border, Power, Violence, and the Decolonial Imperative. Welcome, Roberto. Our other guest is Trey Freeborn. I'll just bring him up. Trey, welcome. Trey is a queer, non-binary cultural worker, songwriter, and organizer. Trey is a member of Planet Locale, a cooperative and independent music label, New York City artists. Welcome, welcome, Trey. Our next will be Melanie. Welcome, Melanie. Melanie E.L. Bush, Professor of Sociology at Adelphi University, Research Fellow, University of South Africa, and author and editor of many books, including Tensions in the American Dream, Rhetoric or Reality, which was published together with the late Roderick D. Bush. A person that really doesn't need any introduction at all, but I will have the honor of doing so, is Robin D.G. Kelly, Professor of History and Black Studies at UCLA, and author of numerous books, including Freedom Dreams, The Black Radical Imagination. And last but not least is Margo. Margo Okazawa-Rey is Professor Emerita at San Francisco State University. She is author of Gendered Lives, Intersectional Perspectives, and many other books. We have a wonderful, wonderful group of people here. Welcome to you all. Let me perhaps start off with some comments, some questions, really. What do we mean by the politics of love and rebellion? You know, the old song, what's love got to do with it? Do with it. We're living in a period of rebellion, certainly in the US. And those that capital has for centuries cast out into the sacrifice zones have begun to stir once more. If we don't rebel, will we ever discover who we are? Does choosing rebellion mean embracing love? Is that the pathway to rediscover a common humanity? If rebellion is not about love, what is it about? And rebellion is, I think, more than revolt. Revolt surely is an expression of desperation. We revolt, said Fanon, simply because for many reasons we can no longer breathe. But is rebellion fundamentally more a propositional, exploratory, inventive, and profoundly conscious of love, even if it may not explicitly verbalize that aspiration in any movement? Isn't love in rebellion something that demolishes the temporal and parochial preoccupations about identity instead of implicitly seeking to establish a universalist humanity? Does it mean that while accepting that there are and always will be a multiplicity of identities, being black, brown, gay, trans, non-binary, whatever, love provides perhaps a common aspiration towards discovering what it means to be human? Is there a seed of universality in the impulse towards love and rebellion? Is Alain Badiou right to say that, quote, love is always the possibility of being present at the birth of a world? Love must surely be something that invents, and rebellion surely is a starting point in the reinvention of humanity. We need to hold outrage against injustice and divisive politics in one hand, and the potential for love in the other. If we only feel outrage, then we exhaust ourselves with activism. While if we only feel love alone, we end up as hopeless romantics. Holding both is how we become greater than ourselves, I would suggest. Many, many questions, many perspectives, many points. Perhaps I can invite each of you one at a time to speak for 5 minutes. You don't have to necessarily react to the questions that I've posed, but feel free to talk about how you see the politics of love and rebellion. Could I suggest, Roberto, would you be willing to kick off the discussion?
Yes, thank you. First of all, let me say, Kualitlanesi, Kualioali, Nanotoka, Roberto Hernández Nanansin, Wirarikatlali, Tatatsin, Mantlali, Ni Ilse Yikpa, Kumiaitlali. Good morning to each and every one of you, or good afternoon, as the case may be. My name's Roberto, and I come on my mother's side from Wirarica territory in west central Mexico, and on my father's side from Mam territory on the border of Chiapas and Guatemala. And I bring you greetings from Kumiai territory, which is where I'm located. And I begin in this way because for me, it's important to note that one of the ways in which the modern colonial world organizes itself is precisely through these erasures, these types of erasures. And so when we talk then about love and rebellion, part of it is also is visibility, right? Making these erasures visible, bringing to light and to life the various worlds that exist, that coexist, that we come from, that our own peoples come from. And I begin that way because, when we talk then about love and this possibility of universality and love, at some level, right, we also have to ask, well, what is love? How do we conceive of it? How do different communities, different peoples conceive of it? And what comes to mind for me in particular, and I think Firoze, you did kind of begin to touch on it, was this notion of being present. I believe you said being present at the birth of a new world. I actually had here in my notes being present. I wasn't as precise as you, but by being present, what comes to mind also is ideas around relationality, reciprocity. How do we show up for others simply because we care, simply because we recognize in each other the same breath of humanity that feeds our life, right? Whether it be in, through different understandings of this and different traditions of the world. In the Mesoamerican world, we say in Nahuatl, "Noshtim no mekayotsin," which is a recognition that we all come from the same sacred essence. When I've traveled to Aotearoa, to Maori territories, they greet each other with a hongi, which is the pressing of each other's nose to nose, and a simultaneous taking in of that breath that is, again, the notion that we share the same breath that gives us life. Where we talk about Tawhid in Islam or Ubuntu these notions of the unicity, if you will, or the oneness of everything, and the connection and relationship that we all have to one another. In the Lakota tradition, some might be familiar more with, people say "Ho metaku yasin," which is all my relations, right? That recognition that we're all part of one larger living unknown, if you will. Now, rebellion, I think of rebellion in terms of, here I follow the work of Mexican Argentinian philosopher Enrique Dussel, who speaks about a state of rebellion as one that supersedes the rule of law and also supersedes a state of exception. That it is in those moments of rebellion, when what might have seemed at one point logically plausible, yet physically impossible, is now somehow politically not only feasible but politically present, right? That in that moment of rebellion, we've seen it lately with some of these demonstrations, and in particular, in the early days following the death of George Floyd, I would say rebellion gets the goods, right? It's only in the moment of actual rebellion where now, in a matter of days, a matter of weeks, we're actually seeing moments of transformation, right? So that distinction then between making what was once previously thought impossible possible becomes very, very palpable. It becomes within reach. Now, what happens if we don't have clarity and conceptual clarity in what we're striving for? Then we could go in all directions. We could have no sense of direction. So I think also we need to think about moving from rebellion to organization, from rebellion to transformation. But that can only happen with having a clear sense of what are we in this for, right? Are we in this for truly a love for the people, right? And if part of how this modern colonial world has fragmented us into these various different social categories, be they continental identities, national identities, gendered identities, racial identities. How then might we turn? And I apologize because I hear some construction work out here. How might we turn to words that Aníbal Quijano, in an essay, I believe, on coloniality of power, Eurocentrism in Latin America, he ends this essay with what I find to be some of the most striking words that I've been grappling with probably now for over the last 2 decades. And he says, to paraphrase, let us cease to be what we never were, right? Let us cease to be these various different identities, categories that were in essence imposed on us, that we have internalized, and that we have even reproduced and used as basis for continued separation. So how then do we think about that unicity, that relationality, that reciprocity, in such a way that undoes or um, these categories that we have imprisoned ourselves into by virtue of the modern colonial world. So the last thing I guess I'll just say by way of introduction is that this particular moment, this time of coronavirus and pandemic and lockdowns and being forced to stay put, if you will, has also, I think, forced upon us a moment of reflection. The mamos in Colombia, elders have spoken of this virus in essence as a messenger, that the virus brings a message from Mother Earth. I, for one, have been thinking about this virus as both messenger and message. That this virus is, in essence, points to how the problem is not just obviously the actual disease. Of course, we can't minimize that, but virality itself. wanting, the desire to go viral, right? To work through social media, to engage in this rapid speed, like the nonstop battles in social media, Instagram, Facebook, what have you, where people don't listen to each other, where we don't have actual conversations, right? It's about who gets the most likes, who gets the most followers, quite literally, right? Creating so-called thought leaders, and it's about losing that sense of community, right? So we say here in San Diego, social media has followers. Centro Cultural de la Raza, which is a space I work with, builds community, right? Builds relationality, builds relations, and I think that is one of the key lessons, and I'm very much looking forward to everyone's contributions today. When we think about what then does it mean to organize with love, to rebel with love, right? To hold those two in a constant tension, to build a new world. But every world must first be dreamed, and I think that's where we're at right now in the period of dreaming.
Thank you so much, Roberto. Nice, great thoughts. Yeah. Okay, let me invite Trey. Would you like to take the floor? And you need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I could talk. Hi, everybody. I'm Trey, here in New York City, in Brooklyn. A little bit about my work. I'm a cultural worker and an organizer here, and part of a collective called Plant Locale. We're a cooperative music label that's trying to uplift the voices and, other institutions, cooperative institutions from Black and other colonized people. Recently, we've set up the work, taken about the work of reclaiming a park here in Bed-Stuy, a historic Black neighborhood that has been run over by gentrification. And we are trying to transform this park. And a lot about what we're talking about is love. It's about self-love. It's about Black love, but not in a way that has been commercialized. Black love as in, loving the Black rebellion. The Black rebellion. The natural way of Black people, which is to rebel against our oppression. So in this conversation, a lot of what I'm thinking about is coming from my perspective as a Black gender nonconforming person, and thinking about love and accountability a lot right now. One of our artists has put out a mix, and there's a sample on the mix that talks about the very, very huge disconnect in this culture of being able, of the thought process that you can both love and abuse someone at the same time. That's never true. If someone is abusing you, then they can't be loving you. There's something that has to shift, there's something that has to change. And I think a lot of times in gender nonconforming, being a gender nonconforming body, being in, spaces as that, we are told that abuse and love can be in the same space. And so I'm really thinking about right now, how accountability for our organizing is really coming into this. As again, coming from perspective, I've seen a lot of trans voices silenced in academia. I've seen a lot of trans voices silenced in Marxist organizations, racism in Marxist organizations. Different spaces that are supposed to be revolutionary are really, really pushed by a lot of the urgency that's mandated in this empire towards enforcing the same hierarchies and silencing Black gender nonconforming and trans voices. And so the question that I'm bringing to the space is what is needed to create that shift. Often I'm also seeing that the OGs, as I call them, older people who have been organizing for a long time, there's a lack of a mental shift around love in the same way, around this idea about love and abuse, that someone can both be abusive and loving at the same time without making a boundary, and without addressing the source of the pain. I've seen a lot of forces in the trans community and gender binary, community, be incredibly organized, be building mutual aid systems, be building accountability systems, organization, moving, money to our people, building institutions for that, being called disorganized when they refuse to be silenced in spaces with cis people, in spaces with, people who, refuse to do the work of shifting. What does Black rebellion actually look like? Black rebellion looks like Black people who are oppressed rising up and being unsilenced, and the throat opening. When we talk about love, we're talking about the process of being in our bodies and being in alignment so that sound can come up and out, and so that the truth can be told from an individual's perspective and not silenced, so that the community may grow in knowledge, in harmony, in alignment with one another, which is the most powerful thing that we have, is our voice. And we see so much of that in our entertainment, but we have to know there's a magic that's happening here that's been taken, taken from us. And Black people are starting to open that up. I really appreciated Roberto for talking about this moment that we're in, of clarity, of an opening. There's no more dreams or illusions to distract the actual conditions. So I'm really interested in how do we end this misconception that the forces that are rising right now from our gender, non-conforming and trans brothers and sisters, to take leadership, and to be consolidated. How is that being silenced in the academic space, in our organizing spaces, in our cultural spaces? And I also want to talk about, the other thing I want to talk about is this idea of humanity. As a Black person, as a person who utilizes social sciences, utilizes these things to analyze our conditions, it's very important to point out that Black people have never been human. Always been relegated to non-human, precisely because we have always seen our path to be in harmony with the earth. The concept of human really needs to be, I think, examined as a European concept, to separate the person from the earth, separate the subject from the object, to create a basis of domination over what is seen as non-human. So I really think we need to think about that, because Black people still, our very bodies are being used as commodities still to this day. You think about, you think about trans people, you think about prisons, you think about, slave labor that's actually still in existence, right? Where bodies are literally being used as bodies bought and sold, traded as commodities. These are Black people mostly. So our relegation, as non-humans, really needs to be brought up, because what Roberto said before, the necessary thing to do is to create a new culture of love for us, the non-human, and the earth. That which has been necessarily outcast, because the basis of the economy is that we are non-humans and can be used as commodities, and then also our labor can be exploited on top of that, and then we also can be taxed. So when we talk about Black love, when we talk about rebellion, love of rebellion, it's really important that we address the colonizer culture and how that addresses us, and that's what we try to do here in Brooklyn, and that's the work that we hopefully will start taking up in more places. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Trey. I think you raised lots of really important issues that we'll need to tease out. Great, absolutely excellent. Melanie, can I hand over to you?
I knew this was going to be hard. Thank you, Trey, Roberto, Firoze. So I open by acknowledging I'm the luckiest person you'll ever meet. Not only do I get to be in conversation with all of you, I had the time, space, and resources to view the Asian Black Solidarity panel also on this channel, from which the idea of this session emerged. Do check it out. I've had a lifetime of connection to and engagement with people who modeled love and rebellion in their daily lives and in relation to me as a white woman. Many of you knew Rod, though also my mother-in-law, Baku, and Honey, and a multitude of friends and family. May you see your wisdom noted here. Many of them were Black women who both challenged and cared for me. Any clarity in my remarks is theirs. The space of learning still needed is mine. I feel blessed and grateful. To me, these fortunes bestow a great responsibility in thinking about love and rebellion, to center myself as a life learner, to fight the good fight, not some days or some part of days, but all day, every day. Like imaginal cells, struggle is an essential part of the process of growth and change. We're engaged here in conversation about a complex tension that exists everywhere within a world shaped by the many binaries of coloniality, and perhaps particularly within the work of liberation. I'm hoping that through this conversation, we can consider some principles to guide us and strengthen us as we have everything to gain. I already suggested to Firoze that Love and Rebellion be a monthly dialogue to bring in voices not present right today. To me, it is that important. So I'll make 4 points. Some people keep Bibles on their nightstand, raised agnostic instead. My remarks share brief excerpts from writings related to love and rebellion that I return to frequently to keep me grounded, thinking, and self-reflective. Rose Brewer, 1999, theorizing race, class, gender, Black women's labor. She said, the conceptual anchor is understanding of race, class, gender, and more as simultaneous forces, critiquing dichotomous oppositional thinking by employing both and rather than either or categorizations, allowing for the simultaneity of oppression and struggle, understanding the embeddedness and relationality of these relationships that need to be historicized and contextualized. With that framing as a foundation, here are my reflections. We need be simultaneously sophisticated and yet also very straightforward. We must root ourselves in complexity and simplicity. We need both and in the big umbrella. For love in the abstract is like the ideas of being post-racial or colorblind, absent context and structure. Love, like violence, must be understood not only through an individual lens, but as an expression of social relations that shape the organization of society. In the present moment, that being coloniality, white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, in the so-called modern world. And the same is true of rebellion. It must be contextualized as an expression of material realities. In 1956, Emeritta said, provincialism, not at all. I'm not burying myself in a narrow particularism, but neither do I want to lose myself in an emaciated universalism. There are two ways to lose oneself: walled segregation in the particular or dilution in the universal. My conception of the universal is that of a universal enriched by all that is particular, a universal enriched by every particular, the deepening and coexistence of particulars. We need to have the patience to take up the task anew, the strength to redo that which has been undone, to invent instead of follow, to invent our path and to clear it of ready-made forms, those petrified forms that obstruct it. 2, we must consider the question of where is our starting point. For Rod's work was rooted in the following quote from his Black Internationalism and Transnational Africa. Blacks have long understood that pan-European racism is the Achilles heel of the modern world system, and that the demographic situation of the United States, which is large, strategically located populations of color, is a key locus of struggle for a more democratic, egalitarian, and just world order, cross-cutting the geographic division of labor between the pan-European and dark worlds. Barbara Ransby recently wrote a very powerful article about how the white left needs to embrace Black leadership to understand that Black Lives Matter is what class struggle in the 21st century looks like. There is no colorblind class analysis. Engagement of love and rebellion needs to emanate from the recognition that those most harmed have the greatest stake and need be recognized for the collective clarity of vision. Indeed, as many have said, if we locate our anchor with the most aggrieved, we will all be lifted. For me, in practical terms, this means that my love and rebellion work as a white woman is located in 3 levels of struggle. I do white people work, for which I feel a profound obligation. I do allyship work to support Black, Indigenous, racialized people, trans, queer, all those whose very lives have been the center of assault in the colonial. And I do comrade work, co-conspirator work, where we work arm in arm, for together we will get free. 3, the political is personal and the person is political. Whether my elders, my children, stepchildren, or grandchildren, all our relationships are mediated through the tension of love and rebellion. When at age 8, Orlando asked, "Grandma, why are you white?" To which, of course, Rod and I proceeded to give a history lesson. And then he asked, "Do you believe in Jesus?" To which we spoke of material ecumenicalism. He indeed was asking, how do we navigate the tension of love and rebellion? What happened to us, and what do we need to do? For family itself, what time we spend or we don't, and Robin, we've had conversations about this, is deeply immersed in struggle, in the question of love and rebellion, and the tension that's embedded there. As our children navigate their place in the world, as we understand the very different journeys that my parents and my in-laws' lives took, born of the same years, with very parallel but very disparate trajectories, love and rebellion. In all of this, there's no formula or guidebook, or perhaps we start here by thinking about what principles and what values must guide us. And so in closing, Savini Selassie recently said, the nature of paradox is that it's puzzling. It asks us to listen deeply and explore the nuances. Paradox invites us to embrace complexity. She quotes Maxine Hunt-Kingston saying, "I learned to make my mind large as the universe itself is large." So there is room for paradox. I am hopeful. I am heartbroken. Love, Savini. And in close, unknown, oh my body, make of me always a being. Slight modification to questions. Thank you.
Great, great. Thank you. So, excellent. Right. So, Robin, you ready to give us a few words?
Yes.
Great. Okay, go for it.
Well, it's great to see everyone. I really appreciate the opportunity to participate in this important conversation. And especially, I just want to acknowledge that I've learned so much about love and rebellion from Melanie and from Rod, who I feel like is the 7th member on our panel, sitting right with us. But I specifically want to talk about love and death in this age of rebellion, or perhaps in this kind of new abolitionist moment, because the catalyst for so much of this urgent wave of solidarity in the streets and just, in our homes has been death. COVID-19, of course, which disproportionately affects Indigenous people, Black and Brown people, the spectacular ongoing state killings in the U.S., and not just in cities like Minneapolis, but in Indian country, in Palestine, elsewhere. This is what we've been dealing with. The killing of trans people, not always by the police, obviously, but in ways that are just not acknowledged, that we need to really pay attention to. So death is everywhere. And it's interesting that, and timely, that 13 museums last weekend, some of you might have seen this, decided to stream Arthur Jafa's film, Love is the Message is Death. And if you haven't seen it, it's about 7 minutes long. And AJ powerfully kind of remixes different clips together that captures the dialectic of grief and joy in Black communities. Now, a separate question is, why do these 13 museums have it, own it? What profit are they making from ownership, and why it's being released because of rebellion? That's another question we can raise. But I come from a tradition, many of us come from a tradition in which the funeral, which is a kind of expression of death, it's called a homegoing. And as a homegoing, it kind of belies the mainstream popular image of a funeral because it is a celebration of the deceased going home, whether that home is heaven or where the deceased is going. God takes the deceased and there's no more toil, no more trouble. And in many ways, AJ's film embodies what many of us already know, that the sacred and the secular are not contradictions, are not the unity of opposites, but a different kind of dialectic in which is the unity and wholeness. And so what we're experiencing now in the joy of rebellion is also mourning, which is what we do when we grieve, and mourning is not about loss or endings. And Claudia Rankine reminds us that mourning is not supposed to be a lonesome, isolated act, but a public expression, a collective acknowledgement of the dead that simply refuses to suppress our rage or anger. Rage and anger is part of that mourning. And then I'm also reminded of Douglas Crimp, the late leader of ACT UP, who pointed out, over 30 years ago, that activists fighting the AIDS pandemic were in constant state of mourning. They were losing friends or losing comrades, lovers, partners, organizers every day. But rather than lead to passivity and to acceptance, their act of mourning, their act of grieving inspired militancy and deepened their commitment to struggle. And I think this is what we're seeing right now. So militancy, mourning leads me to the second thing I want to raise, which is, and this is about love. It's about organizing in this era of new abolitionism, or what Angela Davis calls abolition feminism. The radical politics driving, I think, the best of our movements. And by the way, there's all these critiques of movements that we could talk about. Some of them are so problematic, based on myths, based on who's getting money from what foundation, which is just such a waste of time. But when we talk about the best politics of our movements, by that, she doesn't mean just a world without police in prisons, but a world without the values that produce police in punishment. A world, and this is Angela's words, based on radical freedom, mutual accountability, and passionate reciprocity. And the echo, but what both Trey and Roberto had been saying, and Melanie, everyone's been talking about passionate reciprocity. Abolition feminism is a movement dedicated to eradicating all forms of oppression, all forms of exploitation, ending state-sanctioned violence, ending other forms of violence, replacing police, military, prisons with genuine, humane, non-carceral paths for safety and justice, freeing the body from the constraints of all these inherited and imposed normativities. And I say inherited, but they're also fairly modern in terms of the history of the world, protecting the earth and ending precarity. And that means, and this is the thing, it's very uncomfortable to talk about, it also means rejecting the current focus on using the same carceral system to punish the people who do the work of the state. And that's something that, we have to come to terms with. What does it mean to say we want more jail time for cops as we're trying to abolish jails altogether? What does that mean? But this is also about organizing. And this is the last point I want to make. And that is to say that there's a Black feminist organizing tradition of meeting people where they are without judgment. I'm so glad that Margo is on this conversation because, Margo comes out of that tradition, in a very powerful way, and we could talk about this. It's a tradition that recognizes that any struggle to change, to demand, to defend is always unfinished business. It begins raw, it begins inchoate, as collectivities have to find each other, figure out who is there and how to communicate and what they're doing, like what they're going to do, how they're going to move. And it requires being uncomfortable and even being offended. It means being quiet and finding ways to be heard that can both critique and hold people together. And like Trey Feeborn made clear in their remarks, it means holding people and movements accountable, recognizing that the process of holding people and movements accountable is meant to be transformative. It's not about making a correction, like correcting people who make an error. It's a process in the project of decolonization. And so people come and they do things and say things and act in ways that are disruptive, undermining, and violent. But that doesn't mean that process of trying to rethink our relationship to one another isn't part of the transformative process. It's part of making revolution and part of making love. And I think that it means approaching people with love and solidarity. And by love, I mean the way that Dr. King used it as agape, as unconditional love of community that makes no distinction between friend and enemy. And as he puts it, quote, agape is love seeking to preserve and create community. It is the only cement that can hold this broken community together. When I'm commanded to love, I'm commanded to restore community, to resist injustice, to meet the needs of my brothers and sisters. I added that part. Love then is labor. It doesn't come naturally, nor does solidarity. Love and solidarities, they're fragile, temporary, sometimes forged in struggle and sustained through hard work. Solidarity can produce internal fracturing within groups, sharp disagreements, and new alliances because they're constituted historically in real time, in place. And no solidarity, based on identity of any kind can achieve unanimity. Differences by class, tactics, generation, location, geography, experience, etc., can generate ideological divisions, making solidarity within acknowledged identity groups difficult enough. So we should not be surprised to find in our movements anti-Black racism from other people of color, Black Islamophobia and xenophobia, or general reluctance to build alliances between these communities, or what is most often the most common response, which is indifference. And by the way, indifference is the opposite of love, not hate. Just, Bea Richards taught me that. To expect otherwise is to ignore historical context and political realities. Lastly, while no solidarity is worth sacrificing core principles, difficult solidarities can actually broaden our horizons and deepen our values and embrace our principles. And time is really a factor. But if we could take back time and adopt a much longer view, a much longer plan, we might think about solidarity, not in utilitarian terms, and this has been echoed by other speakers, but, as, tactical alliances, not as tactical alliances, rather to win whatever we're trying to achieve, but really as prefigurative of the society we want to build. Yeah. That is, how do we, build and live together. And King again reminds us that moral principle that is not allegiance to race or nationality or guided his work, but war was making the country that he was living through in the world sick, and militant social movements were the healing salve. So his calling obliged him to side with and support the victims of U.S. militarism, no matter where they are. Or in other words, think of it this way: to be a traitor to the nation state is to be loyal to all the humanity. And the final thing I just want to add to that, just to we talk about mutuality, nonviolence, equality, and love. Roberto made a very profound point about mutuality and reciprocity. I just want to end with the words of my mentor, the late Cedric Robinson, who really established this point for me 40 years ago when he wrote in his book, Terms of Order, about the Tonga people of Southern Africa. He says, each element of Tonga consciousness embraces another to secure its own vitality, a game of life, of running, jumping, spinning, for 1,000-headed millipede beast whose members would each, if severed, be unfit to survive. In other words, this idea, which is antithetical to kind of Western emphasis on individual autonomy, is based on the principle that all are equally incomplete. Without each other, we're equally incomplete. And I think that is, to me, the key lesson in terms of how to move forward and how to develop a politics based on love, mutuality, and passionate reciprocity. And I'll stop there.
Oh, thank you, Robin. So last but not least is Margo. Over to you, Margo. Just before you begin, just to say that we will be opening up the conversation between us, and if you have questions, if you're watching this, if you type them out, either we're on Facebook or on YouTube or wherever, we'll be monitoring those and we will engage you in those discussions. Over to you, Margo.
Yeah, thank you very much. I am right now so full of ideas, of love, of just taking in everything that the previous speakers have spoken about, and they so resonate with some of the things that I've been thinking about. So first of all, thanks to all of you. Thanks to the organizers, Firoze, who put this together. What an opportunity. And it also happens to be my favorite topic. So before I begin, I just want to acknowledge a group of people who have really helped me come to this understanding about love and politics and rebellion. And most recently, I've been in conversations with Deborah Lee, Gwen Kirk, Jose Plasencia, Meredith Staples, Natalie Bauer, Patricia St. Onge, and Cerces Mendez. And through those conversations, I'm getting clear about what I mean when I say that I've come to realize that I engage in the world as feminist, as a woman of color, an activist, and thinker because I love life. I love being alive in my form and in this moment. And anyone who's been around me, you've heard me say this more than once. But what I've been doing is trying to really work out what that actually means, what it means to love life. So today I want to talk about love and life, and at the end, this idea of conspiracy. Before I do, I want to raise a couple of questions that were generated in me as I was listening. So Firoze, you talked about, rebellion as a way that we can come to know ourselves. And I'm wondering if by rebellion you mean disembedding ourselves, from a particular context. I wonder if there are other ways that we can disembed ourselves from our specifics so that we can come to know ourselves from another perspective. I'm also wondering, in this particular moment of Black Lives Matter, the movement for Black lives, Blackness, what Blacknesses are we talking about? Which Black persons, right? And can we think about Blackness both as the lives of African-American people with the history of enslavement in this continent or in this country, right, and other parts of this hemisphere as well, can we think about Blackness in other ways, right? And I know there have been some historical precedents for that, but in this particular moment, can we think about Blackness in very complicated ways? That isn't not simply about a particular group of people, at a particular historic moment. So I want to talk about love. And, you know, it's a couple of days from now is June Jordan's 84th birthday. And she's one of my inspirations. And one of the things she said is, maybe the purpose of being here, wherever we are, is to increase the durability and occasions of love and among and between peoples. So that's one strand of love. And then I want also to, you know, pick up on Robin's reminding us of this idea of Dr. King, the love that is about agape. And here I want to invoke a feminist theologian, Carter Hayward, who says, love is a choice, not simply or necessarily a rational choice, but rather a willingness to be present to others without pretense or guide. Love is a conversion to humanity, a willingness to participate with others in the healing of a broken world and broken lives. And I subscribe to all the ways that Robin and other folks have talked about love and the ways that I just invoked June and Carter. I also want to pull in here, you know, whatever you think of Che Guevara, you know, at the risk of seeming ridiculous, that the true revolutionary is guided by a great feeling of love. And it is impossible to think about genuine revolutionary lacking this quality. And so when I talk about love, I'm talking about the absolute love for the sacredness of life, right? And life, the natural world of human beings. So what if we behave in the way that the Persian poet Hafez wrote about the profoundly generous ways to love and to love forever? And he says, after all this time, the sun never says to the earth, you owe me. Imagine what a love like that can do. It lights up the whole world. And that's sort of responding to this kind of transactional solidarities, instrumental coalition building, and all of that, right? The next thing I want to talk about is life. What do I mean by life? I looked up the definition in the Oxford English Dictionary. There it says, the condition that distinguishes animals and plants from inorganic matter, including the capacity for growth, reproduction, functional activity, and continual change preceding death. Well, that's very basic, isn't it? And very limited in so many ways. And then thanks to Jose Plasencia and Meredith Staples, I was introduced to a book by Mariana Mora, Kutzlehal Politics, who talks about the politics of the Zapatistas and the Mayan philosophies that undergird that movement. And their worldview talks about an indigenous cultural life existence, right? Expressing living as a collective, a way of being in the world as a people, daily aspiration to live in a dignified manner in being in communal relation to the earth, to the natural and supernatural world that envelops us, as well as nurtures social beings, right? And is thus honored, right? And it's a question of thinking about life also as honor, not in the militaristic sense, and not in the patriarchal sense of, you know, protecting those vulnerable people. And they go on to say that, you know, without land, without the ability to plant and harvest sufficient food, without the constant remembering of ancestors in connection to the future, and as part of revering the earth, the elements that provide sustenance meaning of life dissipate. In other words, we need all those things, you know, to really be fully alive, right? And, you know, she goes on to write that this idea of transforming humanity based on the social life of plenitude, dignity, and justice as another part of world mediated by the power to be. Right? not power in the usual ways we think about and relate to, right? That is power overpower, empower, right? Getting power, all those things, right? But in fact, a power to be. And the question that comes from this section for me is, what if we truly strove to transform the material conditions facing us and humanity based on the social life of plenitude, dignity, and justice, and as part of another world mediated by our power to be? And I bring in the concept of plenitude here because I think we, in the U.S. in particular, and other places that have been so deeply shaped by colonization and capitalism, we're deeply steeped in what I think about as the politics of scarcity, right? That whatever is valuable, and this includes even things like pain, right, is scarce, and most of all that we're not going to share it, right? So in the example of pain, only certain people have the right to experience and express pain, right? And so how do we shift from a politics of scarcity to a politics of plenitude? And then the last thing I want to talk about is conspiracy. Here again, I quote what Firoze, what you already said, quoting Frantz Fanon. When we revolt, it's not for a particular culture. We revolt simply because, for many reasons, we can no longer breathe. In a sermon several weeks back, one of the most radical and inspiring folks I know, the Reverend Deborah Lee of the Interfaith Movement for Human Dignity, talked about the concept of conspire. And she reminded us, who were listening to her sermon, that conspire means simply and profoundly to breathe together. Right? How powerful could we could be if we all breathe together to become more whole and humane, so we are better able to do what we must in these times and beyond. We're prevented from conspiring in ways that Deborah Lee spoke about because of what I was just saying before, the politics of scarcity. Not enough of anything, and we will not share. Whatever we have, we won't share it. Whatever little we have, whatever we have. And in this case, metaphorically speaking, what we're not sharing is air, right? And what if we actually believed that conspiracy is fundamentally about breathing together? So I end with one of the people who is inspiring me right now, and probably many of us, and she is Arundhati Roy. And one of my favorite quotes by her, she says, to love, to be loved, to never forget our own insignificance, to never forget your own insignificance, to never get used to the unspeakable violence and the vulgar disparity of life around you, to seek joy in the saddest places, to pursue beauty to its lair, to never simplify what is complicated or to complicate what is simple, to respect strength, never power, and above all, to watch, to try to understand, to try to never look away, and never to forget. And so in summary, I think this is a both and moment for us as Black folks, as people in the US, as members of the world communities, right? It's a time for us to embrace both the particulars and the specifics, and the generalities and the exceptions. Right? And I think fundamentally, this is a time for us to commit to one another in the ways that Robin and other people have spoken about, to commit to a set of ethical principles and processes, right, that will help us move together while at the same time recognizing, deepening our understandings of difference, right, of similarities, of the particulars, of the specifics, so that we can, get to the general. And I remember in that wonderful documentary about Lorraine Hansberry, one of those silly reporters asked her, aren't you just talking about Black folks? Why are you talking about so many details about Black folks? And she said to him, she said, the ways we get to know about the general is through the specifics. So thank you so much.
Hey, amazing, amazing. Melanie, you offer to moderate the discussions from here. Can I just say that there are a couple of questions which have come up in the comments. One is from Florent Rose. How can we keep moving with love, especially in the times of great violence? Violence against our bodies. Quote, the ongoing lynching of Black, brown, and indigenous bodies across the globe, and the deep integration of hate, suppression, and oppression that we POC continue to embody. The second question that's come up is as follows. In our current historical moment, the global COVID-19 pandemic has acted to temporarily decelerate linear time and make clear an imminence usually obscured by the disorienting pace of modern capitalist society. In this brief moment, it has become impossible to ignore the previously devalued work of love, care, solidarity relations as being central to social reproduction and fundamentally constitutive of society. So how do we make the most of it? How do we reconstitute or co-constitute society from this? Well, I'm handing over to Melanie, who kindly agreed to moderate this discussion. Over to you, Melanie.
Yes, I was going to say it wasn't quite volunteering, but that's fine. So I want to first acknowledge so many ideas exchanged here. And before we get to the questions, I wanted to see if two things from each of the presenters. All of you posed questions for us to discuss. And so I wanted to see if you wanted to restate any of those questions and give a round for commentary. And then second, if you want to comment or ask other questions of each other. And then we can go to the questions that were posed in the chats. Any questions that you would like to? I see Trey, you would like to pose a question? Or you're saying that that's okay?
Well, no, yeah, I would love to ask a question. I guess this question is directed at anyone who wants to answer it, but there's been a lot of talk about the Black feminist abolitionist theory, and I'm really glad that that's entering our conversations now. I'm really glad that care and the process of building community and building loving relationships, building trust, is being seen as the center of the work that we have to do. But also, I know that the transitions that need to happen to shift this world are precipitated by the conditions that they're in. And I'm interested in either Robin or anyone else to answer. How do we not allow this politic to be defanged and retain some of its more militant elements, which do call for consequences and recourse for abuse, and for transgressions, especially on a societal level. When we talk about reparations, when we talk about those things, we have to address those things. So I was just wondering if anyone wants to jump in on that.
I guess you did mention me. So I guess I probably should respond to it. And I guess there are two elements to the question. One has to do with how do we not allow the radical, rooted elements of this politics to be defanged. And then the second, how do you hold this, I want to make sure I understand it. How do you hold the state, or those agents of the state, accountable for the violence? Right. So there's two different things which are related. And, on the first, the answer is that that's just been our history. I've always been about fighting back reforms versus transformative reforms. That's not even a new thing. This has been the history going back, from the beginnings of the formation of, a slave-based modern world. How do you move towards and maintain that revolution? Because it's so easy to be caught up in a kind of reformist reform. That is, that you make the situation better. To me, the points that you're raising about what it means in these circles to really maintain a radical politics around gender sexuality is meaningful, because of course there's a feminist position, there's a carceral feminist position, but there's also a feminist position that didn't acknowledge trans identity. That's real, and I think that it's just, and that's why when I mention the fact that these kinds of debates and struggles are transformative, it means that we're moving in directions to be able to recognize now something that wasn't even recognized 5 years ago. So in that sense, it's not a good answer, but it's this constant struggle to stay grounded around principles, and also to recognize. This is the problem with the idea of prefiguration, which sort of responds to the question of temporality. I use the word prefigurative, but prefigurative is kind of problematic because it assumes that we're just sort of planning the future and we're making it happen. But every day, what is being prefigured has to change. Every day it has to change. And so we're fighting catastrophe and trying to make a future at the same time means that future changes as well. On the second thing, it's a very hard thing to say. The state, we need to dismantle the state at some point. And yes, I'm the last one to say, that Derek Chauvin shouldn't be punished. The question is, what does punishment take? Punishment should be reparative. That is to say, the first thing, besides punishing the individual act, is to dismantle the structures that enabled Derek Chauvin to kill George Floyd, or enabled the police to kill Breonna Taylor, or enabled the police to kill Tony McDade, right? So that's one thing. The second thing is, how do you transfer those resources into repairing the communities that are harmed? Massive amounts of resources. This is a small thing, but I remember when there was all this issue about these rich people getting like their white kids in college, by bribing and cheating. And I'm like, they don't need to go to jail. We need to take their wealth and basically put all these Black and brown kids and indigenous kids in college, then go to free college. But they just take their money. It's not, to me, to even Amy Cooper, like, should Amy Cooper go to jail for filing a false police report? What can we do that's more transformative than that? To like make parks, like safe places for people of color, so it's just sort of thinking to the next step, to go beyond punishment to restorative justice. If that makes sense.
Yeah, and Robin, I want to jump in on your comment and responding also to Trey, if I may. And that is, Robin, you said we're changing, this idea of challenging this idea of prefiguration, and we're changing all the time, right? So what, if anything, must we hold on to? What's the through line, right? That's going to get us from here to there. And then what's the there that we're imagining collectively that we're getting to, right? The second question I've been thinking about during this conversation is, what happens when we truly, absolutely look at what we're facing in the US with what's happening around specific places around the world? Because at the same time that George Floyd was being murdered, so was a young Palestinian man under the same circumstances with the Israeli army boot on his neck, right? And so how do we, and this is going to sound weird to a lot of people, right? How do we actually take seriously this category of nation as an analytic category, not just race, class, and gender? And what happens when we put ourselves in relation to the US state, whether we are against the state, whether we love it or what, right? Structurally, we are connected to this state in ways that we don't even know, right? And so when we take that seriously, then how would that shift, how we think about the state violence in this country? So just some questions I think are really important for us to talk about in this moment of the opening that we have. Yeah. Roberto.
Go ahead, Roberto. And then I see this is touch something within those watching, so we'll pull some of those questions in unless Trey wants to respond after you. But Roberto.
You need to.
I thought I was on mute. Yeah, sorry. So thank you for the question. And I mean, to be honest, like, we have to be real and say liberals are going to sell us out. When you ask how do these movements not get defanged, but in response to that, it's more rebellion, right? I mean, constant rebellion, right? Because that's bound to happen. I mean, I think we're seeing it already with calls for defunding of police slowly now evolving to not just community control, but now just community policing. We're right back where we started, right? So there's always that danger, that threat, and the need to constantly keep pushing. And I think it speaks to this question of prefiguration, to bring in the Zapatistas again. They talk, and we lose a lot in translation. Different cosmology to begin with, translated to Spanish, translated to English. But when in Spanish, the phrase is caminando preguntando, or walking while asking questions, right? So we don't have an end goal in mind. We don't have, be it a Bible or a little red book, or Communist Manifesto is going to tell us, this is the answer. We just need to get there. Right? No, we figure it out as we go, and we're walking and asking questions simultaneously, and we're going to make mistakes. But then that's where the question of a spirit of generosity and reciprocity to with one another, to allow us to make mistakes and learn from each other, rather than this cancel culture that's so pervasive. So I say that as a way to segue back, because I do want us to maybe at some point address something that Robin brought up, which is how it is that we've lost sense of this idea of meeting people where they're at, right? That is like, I've seen this since Occupy, right? Here, a lot of different cities started doing, like, instead of Occupy LA, decolonize LA, and so on, right? And here in San Diego, we had the same thing, Occupy San Diego, decolonize San Diego. But Decolonize San Diego was just a group of folks that were basically saying everybody has to declare themselves anti-capitalist, anti-patriarchal, anti-everything, or else we're not going to talk to them. Like, well, okay, go ahead and have your little monologue in the corner. Meanwhile, we got to, do the work of meeting people where they're at, because something brought them out here. And that's the tough work that's continuous and ongoing, And so Zapatistas, again, use the metaphor of the caracol or a snail, slowly but surely, right? We move as fast as our slowest member. We can't proceed until that slowest, quote unquote, among us is caught up with us, right? So ultimately, and I think some have alluded to it here, but perhaps we haven't spoken of it enough, is the question of community and collectivity, right? None of this is going to get done, by individuals. We're not one conference away from revolution, right? I mean, this ultimately is ongoing slow work of collectivities.
I think, Trey, you wanted to make a comment before we go to the threads?
Yeah. A lot of people asking questions. I'm glad that all the responses were perfect. Like, were just really strong, and I appreciate y'all. Something that's coming to mind, especially with Robin, what you said is the process of continually making as we go. We've seen that on the ground, that the only way that we can do real important work here in Brooklyn, at least, is that if we set the accountability and the vision early, you know what I'm saying? And the ways that we know that if somebody's getting out of alignment, we pull them in. You know what I'm saying? Or if someone needs to be made a boundary with, then we can just say, okay, well, we're going to leave you this crumb and then we're going to walk away. You know what I'm saying? And see what comes back. I think that comes from a collective consciousness of love, of self, of the, collective love that a community has for itself and the people, every single individual in it. And I think that's a consciousness thing. But I really want to, when we come down to justice, I want to make an important part is that, as these communities, as these, formations and just in small worlds start to build, and have communication about what justice, what boundaries, what accountability, what love looks like, in the process, the step by step, it's not going to look like the state's justice. And so, for the accountability portion, maybe the state, maybe the community doesn't want to have the killer cop in jail because the core process is elongated. It's, often a lot of things fall. Maybe the community just wants to deal with that immediately. Bang. You know what I'm saying? That's a different kind of justice. You know what I'm saying? You throw up the address and, you just let it rock. That's another, that's a different kind of justice. But we have to not be afraid of what the community decides to do. You know what I'm saying? We can't be afraid of, how justice looks, now, as opposed to what it will look like in the future, as we all start to really look at what needs to look different in the world moving forward. And I think that does come from this really grounded, localized process of building love in the community and building and building those processes of the land and the history and et cetera. But yeah.
Thank you, Trey, for a very provocative question.
Can I pose a question to the panel? If you think back to the 60s and 70s with the Black Panthers in the US, you had Steve Biko, you had definitions of Black, which were political definitions. They weren't based on color of skin, shape of nose, hair, and whatever. What are the new... Okay, it's many, many years ago. So under the new conditions, what does it mean to be Black? Does it mean heritage? Does it mean our genetic heritage? Does it mean color of skin? What is the way in which we have a collective definition that I thought was very powerful in the 60s and 70s, which allowed people of whatever hue who defined themselves in relation to capital, in relation to imperialist exploitation, who defined it that way rather than merely as a color. Just wanted some comments on this. Oh dear.
it makes, if I could, Robin, if you want to first. Okay, it just makes me think about, you know, of course, you know, Zora Neale Hurston, iconic quote, not all skin folk or kinfolk. In this new time of rebellion, what does it mean to be Black is a very hard question, especially, you know, in New York City, where we have a melting pot of different Black people, you know, throughout the generations who have come here, forced migration, you know, throughout the process of, you know, our people's pathway through this Western society. So you have, of course, the West Indians. You have, you know, Black people who've been here for generations. You have Black people who moved here maybe a generation ago, and you have African people who've come over. You know, so there's a lot of different. So that's a really good, important question. I think the work is now starting to figure out what are the parts of our culture that unify us. You know, as far as politically is concerned, you know, I think across the world, Black people are dealing with, you know, housing, you know, medical struggle, you know, struggles in, you know, by having, you know, state-sanctioned violence against them. So there's a grounds for unification, but then internally there needs to be a lot of discussion around what does pro-Blackness actually entail, to lift up a revolutionary perspective and lift up a new culture that doesn't rely on the colonizer culture and the way that our you know, our people have been, you know, taught to think about ourselves and each other. So I think that's maybe the first step. And I just want to put that in.
I think I saw Roberto,
Robin, and then I'll go after.
Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Just very briefly. I mean, it's a very good question. I was trying to avoid talking too much, but but we take the long view. I mean, it's also useful to remember that the first Black regiment in the British Empire were the Irish. I mean, they were called Black. It's also worth thinking about the fact that in Western Europe, the N-word was applied to the Arabs in France. The Black organizations in England included South Asian, Arab, you know, people of African descent, Caribbean, and that within the continent of Africa, Blackness didn't carry the same kind of weight because you're talking about other kinds of identities, nationalities, distinctions. And so, if anything, Blackness, and I think this is the point you're making, Firoze, is that Blackness is a political identity. And as a political identity, it's one that is always being contested because we're also living in a world where many of the people who signed the laws that put us in prison for a long period of time are Black, you know, identify themselves as Black, that Black people represent a kind of rainbow coalition of class rule. That's in many of the cities that we live in, the people that we think of as like our people are not, as, you know, as Trey mentioned, definitely not kinfolk, but in fact, on the other side of neoliberal capital in racial violence. I mean, I can't believe that Jay Johnson of the Obama administration is suddenly trotted out as like some representative of justice when this is the person who bragged about the use of drone strikes to kill people around the world. I mean, so we really think about Blackness. We've got to think about like what are the structures that produce the idea of Blackness, and how do we basically build an abolitionist or revolutionary movement that could overturn those structures, and who's going to be with us in the process?
Roberto?
Can I just quickly comment on that last point? I mean, Robin, Amilcar Cabral talked about this whole issue. I mean, I did Mao actually in the revolutions in Guinea-Bissau, and he said we must distinguish between what we call the people and what we call the population. The people are those who are fighting for the liberation. The population is everyone else. One day they may come over, but we have to define it politically, not in terms of either location or otherwise. And I think that's something we need to try to develop, because it deals with Trey's thing about the people who always betray us. That's been part of our history. We were sold by slaves. We were sold by people who made a profit out of slavery, and so on. So I do think that distinction is something that needs to arise and think through what Black really means.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, maybe to try to tie some of these threads together, because I was already kind of gonna go a bit in that direction. In our previous conversations before this live stream, I had mentioned the work of a Dominican colleague. Her name's Ochi Curiel, right? And she has asked the question, right? Okay, we talk about Black is beautiful, but we don't always necessarily ask the question, how did we become Black, right? And so that then leads us to these structures that create the notions of Blackness that I was talking about, and I approach it more through a question of indigeneity. In France, there's a group named it began as a movement as the Party of the Indigenous of the Republic. But their ways of engaging the notion of indigeneity is not that they are the original peoples of the territory now known as France, but rather they are Algerians, Martinicans, they are people who were colonized by France and now identify as indigenous to the Republic, in the sense that the colonial question means that they were indigenized, right? And so by highlighting the question of indigenization or being indigenized, it highlights the colonial relationship. And in many ways, we could, as a Chicano, I would say, we are people who were first indigenized and then later de-indigenized, and were detribalized, right? So we're neither nor, right? And it's in that double negative that we affirm life itself. We are, simply put, right? We are, and that's it. And so I think there's a way to circle back. And here a colleague of mine, Marcel Mas Cohen, pointed out to me an observation I would have missed had it not been for her, which was in the 4th edition of this bridge called My Back. Cheri Moraga adds a slight footnote or addendum, if you will, to the original introduction or a quoting of the passage from the Combahee River Collective statement. And she cites a part where it says, if Black women were free, and I'm paraphrasing here, we would all be free. But after Black, she places within brackets the word indigenous. Now, this is not meant Black or indigenous, because then we're already reifying categories of the modern colonial world. But rather what it is making an intervention that even those who are in this modern colonial world called Black were themselves, I would say, not so much indigenous peoples of the continent known as Africa, but original peoples that were then themselves indigenized and in that process turned Black, right? So it highlights the processes, right? And so the last point, I feel like I'm talking too much, but I'll just say one last thing, is that it circles back to the question Trey brought up earlier about leadership. And, I, for one, reject these notions of we must follow such and such leadership, because we might be giving into a liberal politics, right? So instead, it's important for me to think in terms of what are the different critical positions emerging from the diverse social historical identities and experiences, right? Not all Chicanos are critical. Not all Black folks are critical, right? I mean, some can lead us down these Jay Johnson routes, right? So we need to be even more precise in highlighting critical positions rather than just any position coming from these diverse social historical experiences and identities.
I just want to make a clarification here as a member of that group called Combahee River Collective. When we talked about, when Black women are free, everybody will be free, we were not saying that we're the most oppressed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What we understood in our oppression and understanding capitalism and imperialism is that our freedom absolutely depended on transforming the structures and processes that created us, racialized us, oppressed us in the first place. And if we fundamentally change those, right, then there will be other ways that other women, in the case of our statement, could be free, right? So I just want to clarify that. And I think, people have taken this idea of identity politics out of that statement way afield from how we intended it. So this is my chance to kind of offer a corrective and to say it's about transforming structures, practices, right? Not just about freeing particular bodies, right? Because if those other things are still in place, there's always going to be an N in a structure that exists now. It doesn't have to be Black people, right? So just that clarification, just in case people here in this group or outside have the idea that we thought we were the most oppressed.
Thank you so much, each and every one of you. And in fact, you're making the argument and being very persuasive. I hope Firoze is hearing. This needs to be a series because so thank you. I mean, the $20 is on the way to each of you.
Can I just say one more question? I know we're out of time, but I think this also goes to, what folks have been saying, and that is we talk about transforming structures, all those things external. So the question I've been struggling with and asking my folks, as it were, is in the process of changing the things we're talking about changing, what kinds of human beings must we become so that we can live in this place that we're imagining and that we're eventually going to create without messing it up? Like so many other movements before us, right, have sort of just ended up reproducing. So the other important kind of philosophical, political question is, what about us, right? How do we need to transform? So I've said enough as well. Thank you so much.
Never enough from any of you. So we have 30 minutes and we have much excitement in the chats. What I'd like to do is to use Margo's question to us about the structural, but also the type of human being that we strive for, the type of being. And I appreciated Trey's point about that. I'd like to state so that it's clear the questions that have come from those who are here. And I see that people are asking for further readings. So we can post a place where additional materials can be posted. But so I'm asking the panelists to please think of closing remarks anchored in Margo's very, very important question, change the structure as we think and vision about who we are. I'm going to just say some of the questions that came, and then each person will have probably 3 to 5 minutes to do a closing statement. Fumi said, love is labor, to reflect on meeting people, women, where they are. Very important. Florent, how do we keep moving with love, especially in times of great violence that we, people of color, continue to embody? Matt, it's become impossible to ignore previously devalued work of love, care, and solidarity as central to social reproduction. How do we make the most of this? How do we co-constitute society from a ground of love? What does restorative justice look like for killer cops? Thinking within abolitionist frameworks and love and the radical imagining of society, how do we redefine justice? Would it be through reconciliation? How do we take their money without threat or violence? I don't think they'll just give it up. That's from Alex and Jose.
Me neither, Alex. Me neither.
What is a concrete way of moving to taking their money? I believe, Jose, that's the reference. Eric asks, what non-jail community container could safely hold them? There's a question about the Zapatista movement in Mexico and their ability to sustain autonomy. What happens if the community itself is racist? What happens to the population in that case? And I think then the question of readings. And I think we'll figure out a way that posted with this video will also be some suggestions, but each person here is welcome to offer some direction in terms of places to look. We can also post in some of the writing of the people right here on the panel. So could we go right through the initial sequence and start with, so I guess we have like 2 minutes, about 3 minutes per person, with starting with Firoze.
Well, I think there's one thing that we haven't really discussed, and that is the state and state-oriented politics, which I think are problematic because states inevitably imply hierarchy, those who rule and those who don't. And it's premised, I think, on this idea that people don't think, that people have a capacity to think, that they are creative, that one has to have faith to believe that even if it takes a long time to go through different pathways, that people will, because of their experience of oppression, because of their relationship with capital, because of their relationship with colonialism and imperialism, do have an experience to speak to. They have a capacity to engage in that creativity. And it's in those struggles, why rebellion is such an important thing. It is in those struggles that the greatest creativity occurs. People talk about organic intellectuals. They emerge out of those kinds of struggles. And I think too little attention we perhaps pay to the creativity and inventiveness of popular movements. Yes, there will be times when they get it wrong. But freedom is about the right to make one's own mistakes, and I think that's one of the things that we need to think about much more in terms of it's not so much reform or revolution. It's about saying, look, state-oriented discourses, state-oriented politics, even the NGOism, which is about state orientation, because it asks for legitimacy from the state. I think we need to explore that much more, to talk about what are the capacities. And I think the Zapatistas have shown an immense creativity in that, and taking time to allow people to be able to give expression to those experiences. So I think that's my one small point here.
Thank you, Firoze. Roberto.
Yeah, so much going on that it's hard to really compact everything, but just a couple thoughts that come to mind on some of the ideas brought up. I was reminded also of Gloria Anzaldua's when she says, we must do both inner work and public acts, right? So it's not just like as one of our colleagues, Ramon Rosfogel, say sometimes, right? It's like if you just do the inner work, you become a hippie. If you do just the outer work, you become a good Marxist, right? But we need both. We need a good balance between the inner and the outer work. But ultimately, what I think some of these questions that have been raised brings up for me is also when we talk about not just love and rebellion, another concept we've been throwing around a lot is life itself, and how do we conceive of life? What and in the works of Politics of Liberation, or 20 Theses on Politics by Enrique Dussel, where he talks about life as the ultimate criteria, criterio vida, right? Life itself is a criteria of the politics of liberation. But life, I think of it more in terms of, thinking what are the and it gets to a question of what subjectivities do we need to enact this new world, if you will, is what is our relationship to the sacred four elements of life itself. When I think life, I think fire, water, earth, and sky, or air, right? And so in my training, academic training, if you will, with coming from a world systems analysis and Wallerstein, and we always try to think, okay, how is time and space or space-time operating here? Lately, I've taken more to ask myself, how are the four elements operating here? What is our relationship to the four elements of life itself? I mean, it's no coincidence that this quote of Fanon that we keep throwing around about the inability to breathe, right? It's about being denied one of those four elements of life. When we talk about, land struggles, or, from a Marxist perspective, historically, we've thought of them as natural resources, air, gas, land itself. No, these are struggles over the four elements of life itself. So I think we need to reorient our own subjectivity to think about what is our relationship to the four elements at all times, right? Whether it be land, air, fire, conceived of in various ways, right? I love to see the sun rising in the morning, to feel the warmth of its heat, to see and engage and be in reciprocity with the flow of the water and the air, the breeze and the wind, the regenerative power of Mother Earth herself, right? How do we walk in this world constantly in prayer in relationship to these four sacred elements? That, I think, is at least, a first stepping stone that comes not from me, but from what elders and their elders before them have passed down to us, right? How do we orient our lives in that way, to thread carefully and not offend anyone, really, or any other form of life in our walking through this world, right? And in real our ways, in an intergenerational way, in a way that recognizes the people as a political concept. And I like that distinction between people and population. I would say there's also a way to think about people and anti-people, frankly, right? Because sometimes they're not just population, but they're anti-people. And when they join or become part of the people, la raza, as we say, and I say that proudly despite some debates right now around the term la raza, when you become part of la raza, it means you're down to struggle for the people, right? That is being part of this people, so that ultimately we can, in fact, conspire and breathe together. And so I love and appreciate that Margo shared that, because I was also thinking about that Maori example of the honi, that greeting, which is at the most basic level of life, breathing together.
Trey.
This was a really amazing panel. Thank y'all all for what y'all brought to this. I think especially coming off Roberto's comments about the four elements and being in alignment with the earth, to stop seeing ourselves as separate with the earth, and continue to develop this process of decolonization, to continue to develop this process of practices internally and externally that promote harmony, that promote our harmony. But I want to also talk about the creativity factor and how that is going to start to emerge from the most silenced groups, classes, whatever you want to call them. There's a time right now of emerging revolutionaries, a group of people that are very much in their very small stages, baby stages right now. It does not look like they are the emerging revolutionaries, but there is going to be a group of people that looks whole scale nothing like the organizations, the political formations that we see today. And we need to keep that in mind in lockstep with everything that everyone is talking about, the continued process of what this is going to look like. So just having that openness, having that that energy to allow for space to be made for this new group. that's going to emerge, whether it be young people, whether it be trans people, whether it be, even some of these young European heritage people who are deciding that, white supremacy does not work for them either. So there is going to be a new emergent group, and I want us to, really just hold that in our hearts, that this is happening and this is a process that the earth has been going through, since this great turn off of the path called colonialization. I want to encourage Black people out there listening to have Black conversations about the reality, because our creativity is incredibly important, and the conversations we have together, as a people about our specific conditions are really going to elevate, our ability to join the scattered forces, and to, consolidate a seed of what will grow into, perhaps a new perspective that, has the people as a political centrality. So, and then I also just want to give a quick, thought about localized and land-based struggle. I was talking to somebody the other day about the land not just being, the cultivation of the land, the process of harmony between the people and the land being a process of exchange. And, people do give their blood, they give their sweat, they give their tears to land, of course, as we know. And, in that process, it's very important to, those are the people who are going to be in most harmony with the space and with the history and with the, with the processes that need to happen, the creativity, the spiritual force that's going to bring that creativity out, that's going to bring those new methods out, that's going to bring that group of the most revolutionary forward. And so I feel like anytime we're in new spaces that might not be familiar to us, it's so important that we, look to align and be in alignment with the forces of the land, and the people who have pushed their blood, sweat, and tears in the land. That's what we try and do here in Bed-Stuy in Brooklyn, trying to do all Black formation here in Brooklyn, Bed-Stuy. So yeah, that's it. That's all I got to say, y'all. Thank you so much for having me today.
Thank you, Trey. Again, so many different pathways for this conversation, that really this issue of what questions do we need to be asking is really the starting point. And this question of what are the values that we bring to the particularity, but also to the much bigger questions of what are we building? What are the principles that we always go back to in this very dynamic process of transformation? And I too, Roberto, went to some of Wallerstein's writing and thinking, all systems come to an end, and he had predicted 30 years. And this idea of multiple temporalities, that we can be living different realities at the same time. And there's, I think it's important as we grapple. Robin.
Yes. It's so interesting how, if you talk about restorative justice, when it comes to cops, it's like people get apoplectic about it. They're like, oh, what? What can you do? You got to take them out. And I just think it's so interesting because I remember when Angela Davis gave a talk at the Race Matters conference back in Princeton in the 90s, and she proposed the idea of abolishing prisons. And you're in a room full of Black people, many of whom consider themselves radical, and they were aghast, abolishing prisons. So I just want to just raise this, that restorative justice is not like an overnight fix. I mean, look, I put killer cops in communities with a lot of people of color in having to work with them. It's kind of an interesting idea, but I'm not proposing that. But we can learn a lot from some other thinkers. Beth Ritchie wrote this very important book called Arrested Justice, which critiques a system that simply locks men up. In other words, critiques carceral feminism, locking men up, and also punishes women for deviating from heterosexual nuclear family norms and strips them of social safety net support. And never, ever seriously addresses sexual violence and its victims. And so again, this goes back to Firoze's point about the state. And in that book, she offers a critique of the limits of turning to the state to deal with these forms of violence, not only because it expands the prison population and behaviors associated with caging human beings, but it kind of makes it impossible to recognize the state's complicity in perpetuating violence against women. It's not an accident that cops and people in the military are often the biggest perpetrators of sexual violence. That's not even a surprise to us, but it's the state that perpetuates that. And I just want to give two last things. One, there's a group in Brooklyn, has a long history, called Sister to Sister. And, they have the best model, I think, of figuring out a way to move the carceral and police state out to deal with domestic violence in their communities. And I would suggest people read about them, but the brief story is that they said, if we keep calling the cops to deal with domestic violence, they move toward deportation. They move toward arresting people and taking out of our families people who are income producers and people we care about. How could we solve it? So they began doing street theater, having vigilance committees of women to protect each other, and they eliminated the police presence pretty much, and they reduced domestic violence at the same time. Finally, to end on Margo's question, that is, how do we adopt the challenge of changing ourselves? I point to Jimmy and Grace Lee Boggs, who have long challenged these old dichotomies, and rejected simple pronouncements of, for socialism or anti-capitalism, but they always focused on questions like, how do we grow our souls? That was their terms. How do we shift our thinking away from seeking, comforts and upward mobility to create the beloved community, and to live lives committed to ending inequality on a global scale? And they always emphasize community development, values of cooperation, mutuality, nonviolence, love. In other words, they try to model what the beloved community is supposed to look like by changing the way that they behave, but also the way that we think about how we behave towards each other, and that's revolutionary practice. It may not be aimed at the state, but the state is involved in reproducing those kinds of behaviors, and trying to deal with it is not something that you do by simply having a demonstration.
So I will note before we get closing comments from Margo that there is a number of resources already posted in the chat. We will save these, and anybody who's interested in getting suggestions by the panelists or by those attending, you can just email me and I will forward that to you. We'll compile that. And so, Margo, you get to close us out, rightfully so. And just huge thanks to Firoze, to each panelist. And we'll see you a month from now.
Yeah. Well, so I'll just start, Robin, by saying that Grace started talking about growing our souls much later in life. So, that's not necessarily the place where she started. And I think that's a good example of how we can change, and we change with the new learnings. So I just want to say just a couple of things. I think we need to have some new geometry lessons, right? In other words, how do we think about relationships other than center and margin, for example? How do we think about relationships that's not hierarchical, right? With the apex and the base, right? The most and the least, those kinds of geometries. I also think about, what's the nature of what should be, what do we want before we abolish the state, right? The nature of our relationship to the state. And by our, I mean, marginalized peoples, movement people, all of us, right? And I also think about, Roberto, to your point about the 4 elements. I think about how do we need to disembed ourselves from our own worldviews. So, for example, we know that in some worldviews, there are 5 elements, not 4, right? You think about Chinese traditional worldviews, that's 5 elements, right? Because it includes wood, in addition to the 4 that you mentioned. So how do we learn to disembed ourselves? What kinds of settings will help us do that, right? And also then not end up with, this is the right one, the 4 is the right, and the 5 is the right, right? That's getting into the whole same old argument. And the other thing is, I think that, again, I want to reiterate a point I made earlier, that this is a both and moment. This is a both and moment. And if we keep the either or, we're all going to go down. We can guarantee that. And then the last thing I want to end with is, we in the US, especially, who've succeeded in schools and all these places where we've succeeded, we've been really socialized, rewarded for being individualistic. Even though we say we're a collective, we're part of this and that group, right? So how do we fundamentally shift from an I to a we way of being in the world, right? And which we, right? And how do we know we actually mean we when we say we, and we're not just using we as a cover for I? And finally, I would say the point about humility, right? How do we actually learn, develop the skill, develop the way of being where listening becomes our primary mode of communicating? So I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
So thank you all. Firoze, you have anything to say? We will gather and collect and make available to anyone the things in the chat.
Yeah, what can I say? But wow,
Fantastic.
An enormous thank you to all of you. This has been just such an extraordinary session. And there are some things that you eat which make you want to eat more. This is one of them. So I'm vastly hungry for more. So let's talk about how we make that happen.
Can I say one thing? I just wanted to plug everybody into our work in Brooklyn, Bed-Stuy People's Assembly. One word, it's on Instagram. Once again, Bed-Stuy People's Assembly. We're trying to erect a People's Assembly here in Bed-Stuy in the historic Black community to lift up community control for Black people here and start to take up, the processes of affecting the political and social and the economic work that we can. So once again, people, we really need a lot of support here in Bed-Stuy. So check us out, Bed-Stuy People. We appreciate y'all.
Okay.
And I think we should be dancing now. See, we need a DJ to play a good song so we can all dance together.
That makes me think. Planet Locale. We have a ton of music on SoundCloud. Planet Locale. We make really amazing music.
Okay.
So everybody check us out. That's local with the E. Planet Locale. Homework.
We put that in the chat, Trey. It's already in there.
Yeah, and then there's the Transnational Feminist Weekly Dance Party.
Yes.
If you're interested, get in touch with me. I'm the DJ.
Terrific. Margo, we all need those glasses, though.
You can touch it on us with those glasses at the end.
That's it. Lots of love. Let's be dancing for the rest of the day.
To you all. Yeah.
All right.
Power to the people. Yep. Bye.
Okay. Bye. Recognizes really something. The proposal has been that maybe we should have more sessions of this kind along the same theme. And if you think so, please let us know and make some suggestions about people that we might invite to be involved in these discussions. So thank you, all of you, for having joined us today on the politics of love and rebellion. This is Firoze Manji saying thank you for joining us here on the politics of love and rebellion, and look forward to seeing you again. And thank you for all the many comments that you posted. And I'm sorry if we weren't able to post all of them, but what a rich discussion from you all as well. Thank you for being with us.